Chapter 10. Ammon headed to the temple the next morning, his stomach roiling with nervousness. He had invented a dozen different messages to try to pass on to Iltani, but he was afraid that she would end up hearing none of them. Just how angry had he made Akala? Would she have remembered to tell her underlings to carry out her threat to bar Ammon from entering the temple? None of the messages he had come up with were adequate. They would all require substantial imagination on Iltani's part to guess what he was trying to tell her. He and she simply lacked enough shared experiences for him to come up with anything meaningful to tell her which wouldn't be immediately obvious to Akala. So, he kept his message vague, and he worried. When he arrived at the temple, any doubts he had about Akala's seriousness were immediately removed. A pair of beefy guards noticed Ammon and made their way toward him. Ammon waited in his best humble pose, head down with hands folded together. "You are not to enter here. Turn around and never return," one of the guards intoned. "I know I'm not welcome," Ammon said meekly. "And I will most willingly withdraw. I only beg one boon. Is there not someone who would carry a message to my sister for me?" "Does either one of us look like a messenger to you?" the fierce guard demanded angrily. To Ammon's surprise, the other guard put a restraining hand on his companion's chest. "Give the kid a break, Babti." Turning to Ammon, he said, "Haven't I seen you here every one of the past few days? Who is your sister?" "My sister is Iltani and Inanna," he replied quietly. The fierce guard who wanted to throw him out whistled. "No wonder he fell afoul of the old hag," he said softly. "I'll find someone to help you out, kid," said the kindly guard. "But make sure you don't move an inch from this spot, or Babti will throw you out on your ear." A few moments later, the kindly guard was back with a white-clad priestess in tow. "I'm told you would like to have a message taken to the High Priestess," she said. Ammon turned to her. She was at least as young as Iltani, maybe even younger. She had a pretty face and startling pale green eyes. He recognized her as the priestess who had led him and Balashi to the feast the previous night. "Thank you for your willingness to help me out," he said. "Would you mind telling my sister that, since I'm forbidden from seeing her, I have resolved to return to Eridu? Tell her that I must see to the sea cows, for they will need to be under my watchful eye every day for the next few months." "I will tell her," the girl said cheerfully. "But if you don't mind my asking, what is a sea cow?" Ammon grinned. "They are some of the tastiest creatures ever created. I'm experimenting with raising them in Eridu. When I mentioned this to my sister, she was very interested to hear about my sea cows. She was worried about what would become of them if I remained too long in Uruk." The girl nodded. "Very well, I will tell her." Ammon bowed. "You have my thanks." The girl left, and Ammon turned to go. The kindly guard put a big, meaty hand on Ammon's shoulder. "I have a younger sister who means the world to me," he said. "I would take it ill if someone refused to let me ever see her again. If you feel strongly about seeing your sister, you might see if you can find some unique or expensive gifts to give to Akala. She has a magpie's soul, and shiny gems and other gifts have been known to change her mind before." Ammon smiled at the guard. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "What's your name?" "I'm Eluti." "Inanna's blessings on you and your household, Eluti," Ammon said. He left the temple and made his way straight to the southern gate of the city. Was Akala having him followed? If so, Ammon saw no sign of the spy as he made his way out of Uruk. At the city gates, a half-dozen guards stood watch, as they had when he and Balashi arrived. Ammon didn't recognize any of them. These guards didn't seem inclined to bother any of the people streaming into the city either. He hoped that Bushybeard and his comrades had gotten into some kind of trouble with their superiors for their poor behavior the other day, and had been replaced. There was a lot less traffic on the road today compared to when he and Balashi had arrived, and at this time of morning there were a lot more people entering than leaving the city. Ammon figured he would be safe enough this close to the city, but he hoped to find a caravan to walk alongside somewhere along the road before it grew dark. The road between Eridu and Uruk had a reputation for safety, and neither Ammon's father nor the king of Uruk had tolerated bandits along the road. But even so, a lone traveler could be tempting prey to even a small group made up of people who were not particularly scrupulous in keeping the law. As the sun rose higher, Ammon cursed his decision to wear the scratchy new wool robe Balashi had bought for him. He had a bare outline of a plan which required him to look at least semi-respectable, but he didn't think the robe was going to accomplish that for him anyway. To take his mind off the incessant itching, he tried to decide what to do first. He needed to get his hands on some shekels. He suspected that his uncle was the best chance he would have of getting anything, but there were a half-dozen other men who had been his father's closest allies among the noble families of Eridu that he might try, if things had gone ill for his uncle. He was also going to pay a visit to Etana on Old Wardham's lands. It might be a complete waste of time, but if he could strengthen his credibility in Uruk by a brief visit, it would be worth it. He also needed to go and see Zuzu. He thought it wouldn't be hard to sweet-talk the funny old man into taking him on as a slave. He could use the free help, and it wouldn't be much of a risk for him if a recalcitrant slave wandered around where he wasn't supposed to on occasion. Ammon had filled his pockets with bread, cheese, and grain before he left, so he snacked on these as he walked. Soon, he was parched, and he was reprimanding himself for neglecting to bring along some water as well, though since he and Balashi owned only a single water gourd, he wasn't sure how he would have carried it with him anyway. After a time, he topped a small hill and saw a well off in the distance. Even better, there was a caravan at the well, and the caravan members were resting and drinking their fill. Ammon hurried his pace, and was soon pouring water from the well bucket down his throat. He looked around at the resting caravan members, for a likely man for him to chat up. He ended up selecting a rotund, prosperous-looking fellow who was resting his back against a wagon filled with bolts of linen cloth. "Good morning," Ammon greeted him. "It is a cursedly hot day today, isn't it?" "What? Oh, hello," the man said. "Yes, it always seems to be my lot to make my journeys on the hottest days of the year. By the time I reach Eridu, I'll have lost a good 5 pounds in sweat, and I'll have to drink like a camel for a week to feel like myself again." "Once we reach Eridu, if you pass by the whales on the Palace Road and take the river road instead, not a quarter-mile after you enter the city proper, you'll find a well with water far cleaner and more refreshing than the oxen-fouled wells of the main road," Ammon explained conspiratorially. "Is that so?" the man asked. "And I don't suppose that you happen to be the proprietor of this particularly refreshing well?" Ammon laughed. "No, the king had the new well dug a few years ago after a servant brought him a cloudy brown cup of water from a well on the Palace Road when he was travelling to Uruk. The new well is public water, and no one charges for its use." "Ah, I see," the man answered. "When you travel with merchants all the time, you soon discover that your travelling companions are willing to provide anything for a price." "I don't doubt that," said Ammon. He stepped closer to the man and offered his hand. "I'm Etana. I'm in the olive business." The man took his hand. "Puzrish Dagon, fine linen cloth, dresses and robes." "A pleasure to meet you," Ammon said. "Excuse me for saying it, but either your olive business isn't very prosperous, or else you've simply forgotten to bring along your wares," Puzrish Dagon told him. Ammon laughed again, and sat on the ground beside Puzrish Dagon. "I was in Uruk seeking to make arrangements for selling my olive oil. I have heard it said that the prices are higher in Uruk than Eridu, and I hope to open a new market for my oil. But if I am to do so, I need to have a local partner, or I will fall prey to tax collectors, soldiers, and other predators," Ammon improvised. "I hope you weren't hoping to impress potential partners with your good fashion sense," Puzrish Dagon commented, with a meaningful look at Ammon's clothing. "This robe?" he asked with a laugh. "I wear it when I travel, so that I make a less tempting target if a bandit happens along." "Who are you seeking to partner with?" Puzrish Dagon asked, the suspicion still not completely absent from his voice. "A man named Dungi. He is in the business of dried pots and silas balls. He assures me that he can get me top prices for my oil, and he's interested in handling the transportation end for me as well," Ammon replied. "Oh, I have no doubt of that," Puzrish Dagon answered ironically. "And I'll bet that if you were looking to sell your mother as a slave, Dungi could find you a buyer for her too." "Dungi struck me as a knowledgeable and friendly fellow," Ammon said. "Does he have a poor reputation in Uruk?" "His pots have a poor reputation, his silas balls have a poor reputation, and his carters have an even worse reputation. Dungi would have to work hard for decades to improve his reputation to the point where it could, charitably, be called poor," Puzrish Dagon replied. "I had no idea," Ammon told him, with a rueful shake of his head. I just met the man at dinner at the temple last night. Oh, and you have some connection to the temple? The man asked carefully. Just an accidental one, Ammon replied. I recently discovered that I have kin there. Oh, I see, the man said. Do you know someone I should speak to who is more honest than Dungi? Ammon asked. As it so happens, I do, Puzrishdagon answered. Though you should no more take the word of a chance-met traveller on the road than you should that of Dongi. I will introduce you to my friend Namhu. He is as honest a fellow as you'll find in this business. It so happens that this is his first trip to Eridu. He's coming here at my insistence to sell his pots. If you know Eridu as well as you seem, you might go and talk with him. He may be willing to entertain the notion of partnering with someone in Eridu. I'd be glad to make his acquaintance, Ammon answered, standing expectantly. Puzrishdagon looked up at Ammon and groaned. Oh, very well, he said. Of course, everything must be done right now with you young people. Ammon helped the heavy-set man to his feet, then followed him as he waddled to the back of the caravan, which was now forming up to leave the well. Namhu turned out to be a young man in his 20s, who had recently been granted greater responsibility in his father's business. He was very eager to prove himself, as Ammon learned within 5 minutes of talking with him. Eridu is still stuck in the last century, Namhu told Ammon as they chatted. The porters there don't even use bellows to heat their kilns. Bellow-fired kilns are hotter, and they cure the pots more completely, making them stronger. I'm betting that if I can get the word out about my higher-quality pots, I can win over the buyers who value quality. A competitor of yours, Dongi, told me that dried jars are best because they're cheap. Fuel for furnaces is expensive and drives up the cost, Ammon said. I'm not surprised to hear that this is Dongi's opinion. His whole strategy is to flood the market with cheap garbage, but I would not risk a single gallon of oil in one of his jars. Make something right and make it last, I say, Namhu told him with a confident nod. As Namhu was speaking, a new plan began to form in Ammon's mind. He thought he could come up with an arrangement that would allow him to travel back and forth between Eridu and Uruk, visit some of the leading families in both cities, and earn some shekels in the bargain, as well as provide cover for his continuing visits to the temple. He hoped that Namhu was truly as reliable as Puzrishdagon said, but even if he wasn't, Ammon himself did not stand to lose anything but time if things did not work out. I think I can help you sell your wares in Eridu, Ammon told Namhu. How much would it be worth to you if I could earn you some contracts? Namhu rubbed his chin. Strictly as a finder's fee or something else? I am talking about a more long-term relationship, Ammon said. Sure, Namhu agreed sarcastically. I've known you for about 10 minutes, and that's more than enough basis for a long-term relationship, isn't it? Ammon laughed. Creating new business relationships requires trust, and it requires risk. I think I can come up with a way to help us earn each other's trust, and minimize the risk if one of us turns out to be less than honest. How exactly are you going to do that? Namhu asked. You say that your pottery work is stronger than anything else I will find in Eridu, true? True, Namhu agreed. So, here's what I propose. I'll fill your jars with oil. You will not sell your pots here in Eridu, but transport my oil back to Uruk. You can keep your jars under your watchful eye the entire time, and I will travel with my oil. I'll pay you a fee for transporting the oil. In Uruk, we will purchase another item in demand in Eridu, and we will go back and forth as many times as we can turn a fair profit, Ammon suggested. But I brought my wares to sell, not merely turn around and take them back to Uruk, Namhu argued. Ammon shook his head. You're going to Eridu to earn a profit, and that you can do easily at a low risk. I think you'll have a tough time selling your high-priced pots in Eridu, for it will be difficult for you to prove their superiority. I think you'll find that the people of Eridu are slow to change their ways. They will want to check with those who have purchased your wares before they risk paying a higher price, but who among them will want to risk being first? If you follow my plan, we should be able to make the round trip between cities many times with minimum breakage. We'll develop additional clients in Eridu who will learn the value of your wares after working with us for a time, and they will tell their friends to go to you to purchase their pots. Perhaps you're right, Namhu said. But perhaps not. I'll consider your plan. By all means, Ammon agreed. Do what you may to sell your wares in Eridu, If you sell them all, so much the better for you. I'll come see you after a few days. If you find that I am right, and your pots are hard to sell, you should consider carrying my oil to Uruk in your jars. Where will you be staying in Eridu? At the home of a man that Puzrish Dagon knows, a certain Yashun Yahad, Namhu replied. Yes, I know of him, Ammon said. With his improvised plan well begun, Ammon was excited to move to his next step. The caravan moved far too slowly for his taste, but he did not fancy getting killed, so he stuck with it, chatting amiably with his new friends, Puzrish Dagon and Namhu, the whole time. How long have you been travelling by caravan to Eridu? Ammon asked Puzrish Dagon. For more than 20 years, Puzrish Dagon replied. Why Eridu, rather than some other town like Ur or Kish? Ammon asked. I like Eridu because things never change there, Puzrish Dagon asserted. If you grow used to dealing with a man, dealing with his son is likely to be exactly the same. If people can be convinced of the quality of your wares, they will continue to reliably purchase them month after month and year after year. If you made 20 silver shekels of profit on the feast day of Enki this year, then you will make 20 silver shekels of profit on the feast day of Enki next year. Surely things are not always so predictable in Eridu, Ammon objected. What of the new king they have installed? Puzrish Dagon shook his head. Bad business, that. There is something rotten involved, mark my words. The high priest betraying and murdering the king, why, it's unheard of in a town like Eridu. It's so unlike anything I've come to expect that I am certain that it was the result of some intrigue from outside the city. No self-respecting Eriduni has a single original thought, let alone something that would so upset the normal order of things. Why, until now, they had the same ruling family in charge of things for millennia. Have you heard something about outsiders getting involved? Ammon asked intently. Puzrish Dagon shook his head again. I know nothing of it, and if you are wise, you will know nothing of it either, the older man said. I will say that it is so far outside the character of these people that I am amazed it could possibly happen. Half of the people of the town are so upset by the change that they put their robes on backwards in the morning and look for the sun to rise in the west. They like things to remain the way they always were, and this changing of things has them questioning everything. I wouldn't be surprised if some other god besides Enki starts making headway in the city now because of it. Eridu has always been the city of Enki, Ammon objected. People won't desert him just because they have a new king. Is that so? Puzrish Dagon asked. What does a young man know of such things? I know that Enki has been worshipped in Eridu for as long as there has been an Eridu, Ammon insisted. And so he will continue to be, Puzrish Dagon agreed. But unlike other cities, Eridu has only ever had one temple. Enki has been enough for the people of Eridu, and perhaps he always will be, but in times of turmoil and change, people get uneasy about the gods. They ask themselves questions. The kings of Eridu have always been called the beloved of Enki, but what does it mean that Enki allowed their line to come to an end? Was the king unfaithful to his god somehow? And if not, why did Enki allow him to fall? If Enki allowed the king to fall, who's to say that he won't one day allow the entire city to fall? Enki would never allow Eridu to fall prey to outsiders, Ammon scoffed. He built the city. If outsiders captured it, they might bring in foreign gods. It wouldn't be the city of Enki at all anymore. He would never let that happen. Never is a long time, Puzrish Dagon cautioned. There have been other cities built by the gods which have fallen to barbarians. What of Nippur? It has changed hands dozens of times over the years. And yet it continues as the city of Enlil, Ammon argued. Certainly, it has always been called the city of Enlil, Puzrish Dagon agreed. But does it not seem strange that each time Nippur has changed hands, the temple has been modified, the rituals have been changed, and Enlil himself seems to have changed? Enlil cannot change, Ammon objected. He is an eternal god. His nature remains ever the same. And yet, at the mountain temple of the god, there are a dozen other temples scattered around, each built to the important gods of those who conquered Nippur, Puzrish Dagon continued. Every time Nippur falls, Enlil seems to take a new wife and father new children, and the priests of Enlil pay their respects to these new gods, whether it be Nana, god of the moon, or Nisaba, goddess of grain. I had never thought of it in those terms, Namhu said thoughtfully, adding his voice to the conversation for the first time. Yet what you say makes sense. I had always wondered why Enlil has so many children, I hadn't realized that they were added slowly over the years. Namhu and Puzrish Dagon talked about the gods for a while longer, but Ammon let his end of the conversation lapse. He couldn't help but be profoundly disturbed by what Puzrish Dagon was saying. How could the nature of a god change when the gods were supposed to be unchangeable? How could anything that mere mortals did, like capturing a city in a war, change the nature of the pantheon that the gods belonged to? For as long as Ammon could remember, the gods had been reliable and unquestioned. Their stars rose in the night sky in their ordained times. The rituals in the temple happened like clockwork based on those stars. A man who wanted to remain in favor with his god had only to burn incense and offer the proper sacrifice, and everything occurred just as the gods ordained. But now, everything seemed to have gotten off kilter. Enki could not be relied upon to protect the beloved family. If Puzrish Dagon could be believed, humans had been changing the rituals and ordinances of the gods and, dare he say it, inventing new gods for centuries, if not longer. It didn't help that Ammon himself had asked some of the very same questions that Puzrish Dagon had raised. How could Enki abandon his family after so much time? Certainly it was not because of anything that father had done. How could humans make the gods react to them, when all of the stories said it was the other way around? Ammon's mind shied away from drawing the conclusion that was staring at him in the face. It didn't make sense for the gods to be so changeable. Puzrish Dagon was wrong, and that was the end of it. When Eridu came into view the next day, he once more renewed his promise to look them up in a couple of days, and then strode off into the town to find the man he had impersonated in Uruk, Etana, son of Wardam. As Ammon approached Etana's house, he began to have second thoughts. His new plan depended on convincing Etana to give him olive oil to ship to Uruk, but in this cheap wool robe and with nothing but some parched barley in his pocket, he wasn't likely to be able to convince anyone. He waited until he turned a bend in the road, where there was a good thick grove of woods and brush nearby, and then he leapt from the road and hid himself in the thicket. He waited there for a good while, until he judged that anyone who might have been following him had given up and gone elsewhere. Then he left the thicket and walked out to his uncle's estate. As he approached the house, someone saw him coming and opened the gate to the kennels. His uncle's great hounds came racing out of the kennel, barking their great bellowing barks and charging straight at him. If he had been a beggar or a thief, he would have turned tail and fled without a second thought. But fortunately, Ammon knew these dogs, and they were jumping up on him and licking his hands in moments. When Ammon arrived at his uncle's house, the chief steward stood on the doorstep. He recognized Ammon, despite his disreputable robe, and the color all drained from his face. He hustled Ammon into the house, glancing this way and that as if afraid that they were being watched. Enmen Luana pulled up a chair next to where Ammon sat in the drawing room. Ammon looked at him, and noticed that his uncle appeared more tired and grey than he had been the last time he had seen him. "We all thought you'd been killed together with your mother and father," he said without preamble. "Where have you been hiding these last weeks?" His uncle's words struck him harder than he would have thought possible. The squeezing feeling took hold of his heart, and it took him several moments before he could compose himself enough to speak. "They are both definitely dead, then?" he asked. His uncle sighed. "Them, most of the palace guard, and anyone the false priest suspected of harboring you. I only survived because I was in the south inspecting my fishing interests. By the time I returned, the priest was more sure of himself. He felt it best not to stir up more resentment with a late execution so many days after the last of his enemies had been killed, especially since he had told everyone by then that you had been found and executed, a pronouncement that I had no reason to doubt until this moment. "I will pay the priest back for all that he has done, I promise you that," Ammon vowed. "But tell me, how was it done? How were my father and mother killed?" "It is sad and terrible," his uncle answered. The false priest promised those he had invited to the sacrifice, which included most of the leading families of the city, that he would sacrifice a bull and a cow the likes of which had never been seen in Eridu. This was assigned to his soldiers, for in a moment your father's guards were killed and your father and mother were taken and bound. Your father cried out for Enki to protect the beloved family, but the priest laughed at him and told him that his god was asleep, and then proceeded to sacrifice them as he said he would. Those present say that the sacrifice was not made to Enki at all, but to some foul, dark god." Ammon felt sick to his stomach. "Did no one object? Did no one rise up and fight back?" he asked. His uncle shook his head. 2 men only. They were struck down by the soldiers before they could utter more than a word or two of protest. Many of those who loved your father are dead, killed right after the sacrifice, their lands given to the false priests as supporters. Any others who might have objected were cowed by the examples made. I am afraid you will only get a very cold reception if you seek to stir up trouble. Even some of those families that I judged among your father's staunchest supporters were quick to betray their neighbors and proclaim the new king. Ammon's expression grew grim. Is there nothing to be done, then? I fear that Lipetenki planned his betrayal too well. He struck so quickly and unexpectedly, and with so much ferocity that the resistance was over before it began, Ammon Luana said. Ammon did not mention his idea of going to the Emperor. His uncle seemed too beaten down and disheartened to countenance the thought of further violence. Do you have a place to stay? His uncle asked. Have you got enough to eat? I have a place where I am as safe as a dead prince can be, but I must admit that I find myself in sore need of shekels. I hate to ask it of you, but if you could spare me some money, I would be very grateful, Ammon replied. I wish I could give you a place of honor here in my house, Ammon Luana replied. But I am watched closely by Lipetenki's spies, and if he had a moment's suspicion that you were here, it would mean the death of you and me and my entire household. I understand, Ammon answered. I did not approach you sooner because I judged the danger too great. Ammon Luana called in his chief steward. Bring me 30 shekels in a plain purse. As the steward turned to obey, Ammon added, If I may impose upon your generosity just a bit further, could you provide me with some better clothes as well, uncle? Ammon Luana nodded, and turning to the steward, added, Bring a pair of good linen robes. To Ammon, he said, If you do not mind leaving through the gardens while wearing the robe you have on, it would be for the best. I don't get many visitors these days, and if someone were to see a stranger, richly dressed and coming from my house, it might arouse suspicion. Of course, Ammon agreed, sensing that his brief interview was already at an end. I thank you for the money and clothing. I hope that despite all the evil that has befallen, you and your house will continue to prosper. His uncle embraced him. I wish that I could do more for you, Ammon Shaw. I deeply regret the passing of my brother and all the ill that has followed. If you find yourself in need, I can give you more money, but it would be best to send a friend or a servant, rather than come yourself. I would give you more now if I judged it wise, but too full a purse would attract attention. If I send someone, it will be in the guise of an olive merchant. I will instruct him to speak my name only to you or your chief steward, Ammon said. His uncle nodded. Enki guide and protect you, he said. The chief steward swiftly guided Ammon through the house and out through the gardens, handing him a heavy purse and a satchel with clothing before turning and making his way back to the house. Ammon frowned as he made his way through the grounds beyond the garden. Was his cause truly already lost here in Eridu, or was his uncle's pessimism just the excessive worry of a frightened old man? Ammon Luana was younger by 2 years than his father, but he had ever been timid and spurned both hunting and fighting. Ammon Luana's caution to Ammon that many of his father's supporters were traitors was very worrying. How could Ammon judge who it might be safe to approach? He made a great loop through the countryside, returning to the road far from his uncle's house. He set aside the question of finding support in Eridu for the time being, and decided to go see his namesake, Etana. The land in the south of Eridu was very pleasant, and there were olive groves growing all across the hills and valleys. After he made the turn-off that led to Old Wardham's lands, Ammon stepped off the road and changed into the linen robes his uncle had supplied. He continued up to where a house stood framed by orderly rows of olive trees, and clapped his hands loudly. A moment later, the door opened, and Etana himself appeared. Yes? He asked. I'm seeking a man by the name of Wardham, Ammon said, doing his best to imitate the slightly clipped vowels of the Urukai. I am Etana of Uruk. Etana came out of the house and stood with his hands on his hips. I hate to have to tell you that Wardham has gone to the underworld. I'm his son, Etana. Belatedly, he added, of Eridu. Ammon smiled and strode forward, offering his hand. Good to meet you. But tell me, is it truly so that Wardham is already dead? What a cruel trick the gods have played on me. Why should it be a cruel trick? Etana asked. He is dead and gone these 4 months. Ammon sighed theatrically. Only 4 months? Truly? Yes, truly, Itana replied, a scowl wrinkling his features as he tried to figure out what Ammon was about. Do I know you? He asked. You look familiar to me somehow. I should look familiar, though I misdoubt you know the reason, Ammon answered. Have you ever, before now, met another man by the name of Itana? I can't say I have, Itana answered. Nor have I, Ammon said. How fitting, then, that the first Itana I meet should be my father's son. He must have been rather fond of the name since he gave it to both of us. Itana's scowl deepened. What's all this, then? He asked. Oh, please excuse me. I didn't realize that our father had never mentioned me. I suppose he was likely ashamed of what he had done, and for this reason he has kept my existence hidden. Oh, great Enki, Itana said, understanding dawning on his face. Another bastard, then? Ammon put on a show of being offended. I assure you that I am no bastard. Warder married my mother, right enough. But after she gave him a son and a daughter, he decided he had had enough of her, and he abandoned her to make her way as best she could alone. Itana frowned. By the gods, the old goat had even more secret lovers than I had guessed, and I already knew about a great many. Now Ammon frowned. So my mother was not the only woman he left in precarious circumstances. Not by a long country league, Itana said. Sometimes I think that half of the people in Eridu were Wardham's spawn, though until now I never heard of one from Uruk. Makes sense, though. The old goat was a great worshipper of Inanna. He left to go to the fertility festivals at the temple there. Ammon nodded wisely. Inanna must have been pleased with his great fecundity. Itana grunted. If she was pleased by it, then I warrant she was the only woman that was. Anyway, now that you know that he's gone, I guess that you'll want to be on your way. Ammon nodded agreeably. I suppose so, he said. His brain was working furiously, trying to work up some pretext for entering into the conversation he really wanted to have. Somehow, he had thought that Itana would act just a bit more brotherly, and at least invite him in for a meal. If you don't mind my asking, Ammon improvised, what type of olives do you grow here? Are they all of the same type, or do you cultivate 3 or 4 different flavors? Itana looked confused. I don't have any types, just plain olives. Ammon smiled knowingly. Is that so? He asked. If you wouldn't mind giving me a handful to taste, I could tell you what type you're growing here. Olives are my business, and I'm quite knowledgeable on the subject. Unless I miss my guess, these purplish ones closest to the house are Great Royals, and the greener ones there a bit further back are Acadian Greens. Itana's confusion continued. I always thought the different colours were just due to them being ripened or not, he said. Oh, to be sure, that accounts for most of it, Ammon replied. But there are subtle differences in the hue that you learn to notice when you have seen as many different olives as I have. Itana seemed bewildered, but he obediently went inside the house and returned with a handful of cured olives. Do you use apple vinegar or wine vinegar to cure them? Ammon asked. I always just use plain old barley vinegar, Itana replied, a bit mystified. Apples and grapes are too expensive to make vinegar for olives. Oh, for common olives I agree, certainly, Ammon replied. But a good strain of Great Royals cured in apple vinegar can sell for 10 times the price of common olives. Is that so? Itana asked, his scowl replaced by a look of calculation that told Ammon that he had him hooked. It is indeed, Ammon replied. Though the technique is known by very few, even in Uruk. He ate a few of the olives Itana had brought, and then frowned. I would just about swear that these are Great Royals, but I can't say with complete certainty, as the barley vinegar masks some of their distinctive flavour. Are Great Royals a good strain? Itana asked curiously. Generally, Great Royals bring the best price, among those with distinguished palates, Ammon confided. In fact, the business that brought me here to Eridu was, in part, finding suppliers for Great Royals and some of the other noble strains. I already have contracts for 12 wagon loads of common pickled olives, and though I did not find so many supplies of Great Royals as I had hoped, my trip here has been far more productive than I could have imagined. Itana looked like he wanted to say something, but wasn't quite sure how to go about it. Well, I am sorry that I never got the chance to meet our father, Ammon said heartily. He clapped Etana on the shoulder. But I am glad to have met my brother. Enki bless and prosper you. With that, Ammon turned on his heel and strode away like an important merchant with places to go and people to see. He had gone nearly 24 paces down the road and was afraid that he was going to have to invent some pretext to return when Etana finally let his greed overcome his reticence. Hey there, Etana, he called out. Could I have a word with you? Ammon turned back. Sorry, brother, I have an important meeting with an olive grower soon, and I need to hunt up some lunch before I meet him. Never bargain on an empty stomach, as they say. Ammon turned to go again. Please accept my hospitality, Etana cried. We'll have a roast goat. I was just about to have my servant slaughter one. Ammon smiled and slowly turned around. Well, I suppose that I can be a little late to my meeting, he said. It will be good to dine in my father's house and to get to know my brother. Little enough was said about brotherly matters, but a great deal of business was discussed. At the end of it, Ammon agreed to take 50 gallons of Etana's purest olive oil and another 50 gallons of pickled olives. Etana agreed to buy both apple and wine vinegar for pickling, if only Ammon would return with a wagon and the jars to carry it all back to Uruk. Ammon protested and offered to purchase Etana's olives. He took out a handful of silver shekels and offered to pay the same rate as he had elsewhere in Eridu, but though Etana's eyes bulged when he saw the money, he still refused. He would await Ammon's return and would take half of whatever Ammon could get for the olives in Uruk. For his part, Ammon agreed that he would take the olives and oil to his most discerning buyers, and he suggested that if they were pleased, he would be able to bring a great deal of business Etana's way. He wondered out loud if Etana knew if any of the surrounding olive groves were for sale, and Etana replied that he would be sure to make inquiries. The roast goat was excellent, and Etana supplied several excellent cheeses to go along with it. He even brought out a bottle of fine wine. Ammon, who even as a prince only drank wine quite rarely, was impressed. The old man brought it back after a trip somewhere to the coast, Byblos attire, I think. He was saving it for a special occasion. I think you would agree that 2 of his sons going into business together would count as something special, Etana said. Ammon held his cup high. Toward him, he toasted. He poured a few drops out onto the floor. Inanna take him into her bosom and protect the females of the underworld. Etana laughed and raised his own cup. When Ammon finally left several hours later, he was genuinely amazed as to what he had been able to accomplish with a little bit of fast talking, some reasonably plausible lies, and an assertion of superior knowledge. Their conversation over lunch had convinced him that Etana knew 100 times more about olives than Ammon ever would, and yet Ammon's invention of a couple of names of olive strains and his proposal for new pickling liquids had been enough to convince Etana of Ammon's superior knowledge. After letting sufficient time pass that he didn't seem too eager, Ammon went to the market to see how Namhu was getting on. Namhu's luck at selling his pottery was worse even than Ammon had predicted. Not only was he looked upon with a jaundiced eye in the market as an outsider, but the other porters in Eridu spoke so ill of him and his wares that he had not sold a single jar in all the time before Ammon came and found him. Chastened by his failure, he agreed at once to Ammon's plans, and took his fully laden wagon to Etana's orchard, where his jars were filled with olive oil and olives pickled in wine vinegar and apple vinegar. Ammon warned Etana before he left to tell no one of their new pickling technique, lest their competitors learn of it and copy it, thereby driving down the price. On the road back to Uruk, Ammon was curious about how his little experiment would turn out. Of course, he knew nothing about the effects different vinegars might have on the olives. He hoped that they wouldn't be ruined by the expensive vinegars, because if nobody bought them, he would either have to use some of the shekels his uncle had given him to make good on his word to Etana, or he would have to invent some terrible catastrophe which kept him from selling the olives. On the second day of travel, he couldn't restrain his curiosity any longer. At lunchtime, he broke open the seal on one of the jars of apple cider cured olives and took out a handful. He nibbled the first olive a bit, then took a larger bite, and at last shoved the entire handful in his mouth. The flavor was not hugely different from normal olives, but the apple vinegar lent it a certain sweet piquancy that was just perfect. He suspected that he really was going to be able to make quite a bit of money selling these to rich buyers looking for a new experience, though he would have to give out samples beforehand to convince them of the difference. The wine vinegar olives were not nearly as successful. The tart taste of the wine clashed horribly with and seemed to increase the bitterness of the olives. He would be lucky to get the normal pickled olive price for these. After he offered a handful of each type of olive to his new friends, Namhu and Puzrish Dagon, and they confirmed his own impressions, he decided to try one more experiment. He took several handfuls of the wine-cured olives and put them in the apple brine, reasoning that he could sell the olives and reuse the expensive brine, and perhaps thereby avoid having to sell the wine olives too cheaply. Once they were back in Uruk, he asked Namhu to introduce him to his wealthy customers, who would likely be willing to shell out more money for his specialty olives. After meeting a half-dozen or so of them, he developed a successful pitch, which ended up with nearly half of them buying the more expensive apple-cured olives and asking that he bring them more. Ammon was even able to convince them that his olive oil was higher quality Great Royal olive oil, just like the apple cider cured olives, and he was able to unload his entire stock in 2 days. A few of the wealthier patrons bought the jars, and not just the contents of the jars, so that Namhu made money both on the transportation of the olives as well as on the sale of the jars. Namhu was suitably impressed with Ammon's silver tongue, and he came away convinced that he had partnered with a mercantile genius. Already, he began planning their next caravan to Eridu to leave 3 days hence. When Ammon went to see Balashi, his friend seemed very impressed at all that he had accomplished in the few days he had been gone. Ammon gave Balashi half of the silver shekels his uncle had given him for safekeeping. Balashi was almost too congratulatory of Ammon's success, leading him on to believe that perhaps Balashi was hoping he would become a merchant permanently and give up his plans to rescue the High Priestess and reclaim his kingdom. When asked what he had discovered about the politics of Uruk, Balashi had only one thing to report. "I only noticed this because of what Tiragan told you at the temple during dinner," Balashi said. "I overheard my master speaking with a visitor I didn't recognize about this god of chaos. There was much I didn't hear, but both men spoke admiringly of the Lord of Chaos. They spoke of this god's love of strength and power, and how he despises the weak and that the weak are the natural prey of the strong. They did not mention the Thalate that Tiragan spoke of, but their discussion of this god suggests that they are either worshippers or will soon become such." "Do you still say that the worshippers of the dark god are a myth?" Ammon challenged. "Perhaps not as mythical as they seemed to me a few weeks ago," Balashi admitted. "See what more you can find out, if occasion permits," said Ammon. "I need to go and find a suitable present for my beloved, and then I'm off to the temple." "Have a few days outside of the city made you forget that Akala will not countenance your presence at the temple?" Balashi asked. "Not at all," Ammon replied cheerfully. "I'll get her a present too. Who knows? If I bribe her shamelessly enough, she may let me see Iltani again." "I wouldn't count on it," Balashi replied darkly. "I don't count on it," Ammon replied. "Which is why I'm going to spend the next few days before I return to Eridu discovering a means to communicate with Iltani without Akala's knowledge." Balashi did not think much of that idea, but Ammon felt as if he could not fail. Certainly some god was with him, for what else could explain his amazing success of the past few days? Even the wine-cured olives he had put into the apple brine had turned delicious, perhaps even more so than the olives that went straight into the apple brine. The same god who prospered his trip to Eridu and his olive business here in Uruk would prosper his efforts to see Iltani. He was sure of it. Ammon searched all 3 markets of Uruk for the perfect presents to give to Iltani and Akala. The things that were truly unique that caught his eye were all far too expensive to be a reasonable present from an olive merchant, and the things which were reasonable were all either too bourgeois or too practical. He was about to despair when he came across a booth in the river market, so called because it was on the side of Uruk closest to the river, with wares that caught his attention. The booth was decorated with rich, expensive cloth, and had on display small jars of the most exquisite delicacy made of costly coloured glass. One jar especially caught his eye because of its bright, garish hues. He knew at once that he had found the gift for Akala, but what of Iltani? He had the merchant show him his entire inventory before he settled on a delicate blue jar which was the colour of sea foam at the top and gradually darkened into a deep indigo at the bottom. There was a small green fish in the centre. It put Ammon in mind of the waters of Enki and the pool of Inanna, which struck him as auspicious. Ammon bargained long and hard with the glass merchant, but in the end he had to part with his entire portion of the olive profits to purchase the 2 items. He filled them each with the wine and apple-cured olives, combed his hair and shaved the ridiculously scraggly beard which still refused to come in properly, put on his best linen robe, and went to the temple. At the temple, Ammon stood across the street, watching the activity inside to see if he could find a friendly face. When he saw the dark-haired, light-eyed priestess who had taken the message to Iltani for him the last time he had been here, he hurried into the temple and caught her arm before she disappeared on some errand. She looked at him with a startled expression at first, but her face relaxed once she recognized him. "I'm sorry to startle you," he said. "But I hoped to catch you before you hurried off, and I don't know your name, so I couldn't call out to you." "My name is Aya," she said. "I know that you are Iltani and Inanna's brother, but I don't know your name either." "Call me Etana," he said. "Listen, Aya, I've come to the temple to leave a present for my sister, but I fear that Akala is still angry with me and would have me thrown out if it were known that I'm here. I wonder if you would agree to help me once more." Aya appeared torn. "I dare not take a message to Iltani without Akala's permission," she said. "I would not ask it of you," Ammon replied smoothly. "Would you be willing to take these 2 presents for me? The first is for Akala, and the second is for Iltani. Go to Akala first, and let her know that I apologize for my rudeness to her the other day, and that I hope she will accept this small token of my regard. This blue one is for Iltani. Both of these jars contain great royal olives, a very rare delicacy in Uruk. Tell Iltani that I miss her and that she is constantly in my thoughts. Also, please mention to her that the eggs of the sea cows are about to hatch." Aya smiled kindly, and Ammon was struck once more by the pleasing contrast of her light eyes and ebony hair. When she smiled as she was doing now, she was really quite striking. She took a jar in each hand and said, "I'll gladly deliver these for you. I hope that you may have some success in softening Akala's heart so that she will let you see your sister again." "I thank you for your kind wishes," Ammon said graciously. "But there is one thing more I would ask of you before you go. I've taken on a partner in my business and will be coming frequently now to Uruk. I intend to bring a small present for both Iltani and Akala whenever I may. Might I impose on your kind heart once every few days to deliver these gifts for me?" "Oh, Etana, it's no imposition at all," Aya assured him. "I'll come to the vestibule every day about this hour and watch for you, in case you need my help." "Not so," Ammon objected. "You're busy, and I will not come so frequently as to justify such a waste of your time." "I'm glad to do it to help such a thoughtful and kindly brother," Aya insisted. "I thank you doubly for your kindness, then," Ammon said, bowing. "Until I return, farewell, Aya." "Until then, Etana," Aya responded. As Ammon walked away, he tried to think about the sea cow eggs in the pool of Inanna. He hoped Iltani would check on them and release their little creatures when they hatched. But the more he tried to focus his thoughts on the sea cows, the more he heard Balashi's voice echoing in his head. "In a few months at most, some other pretty young girl will catch your eye." He shook his head to banish the thought and quickened his pace back home. He would have to be careful how he treated Aya. He was nearly certain that she had already developed a bit of a fancy for him, and if he was not careful, he would end up breaking her heart. Perhaps it would be better if he came at a different time and found someone else willing to run a few messages for him. Preferably someone old and ugly, or else someone male.